Morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's Let's Talk Dairy. So today I'm joined by my colleague George Ramsbottom, and George is going to cover a bit of an update in relation to milk replacer specification and so forth. So obviously, I suppose with the rising costs in general, I suppose when milk price goes up, milk replacer price tends to go up as well. And there may be people asking questions in their own minds whether they'll go back to feeding whole milk maybe or continue with the milk replacer that they might be on. So I suppose George is going to cover the details of getting a good milk replacer, an appropriate milk replacer for rearing the stock that you're rearing, and we'll look at as well the valuing the product as well. So at the end of it, we can take questions in terms of what people are thinking about switching product, whether you're talking about switching back to whole milk or staying on the milk replacer. I suppose from my own perspective, George, I'd be of the opinion that if you've been on a particular regime with the last number of years, I wouldn't go jumping around and chopping and changing just because of milk price anyway.
No.
Your slides will probably give us more detail, or will give us more detail in relation to the actual cost of using milk replacer. So I'll let you share away there and encourage people to put in the questions as we go along, obviously, and we'll deal with them as we go. Thanks.
No problem at all, Stuart. Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just going to talk to you for a few minutes about some of our ideas or the latest kind of guidelines in terms of milk replacers and where we are with all that kind of thing. So, look, there are 4 kind of non-negotiables that have been agreed by the technical working group in Animal Health Ireland, of which I'm not a member, I might add, on calf care, and they relate to a milk replacer for younger calves in particular. The 4 non-negotiables are protein content in a milk replacer or quality milk replacer needs to be between around 23 to 26% are the kind of guideline figures that they use for that. In terms of fat content, if that's where the energy is coming from, that'll need to be somewhere between 16 and 20% are the kind of the guideline figures for fat content of a quality milk replacer. In terms of ash content, somewhere between 7 and 9% is kind of the figure they talk about. I suppose as close to 7 as you can get it. And in terms of fiber content, less than 0.1%. If we just look back at the fat content, we're not too fussy about where the fat comes from, whether it's coming from an animal-derived source or a plant-derived source. Performance of the calf is equally good on those. In terms of the protein content of 23 to 26%, we're a bit more fussy here. And we really like, particularly for young calves, that those proteins should be from milk-derived source as much as possible. And the reason for that is because you could have a high protein content in your milk replacer, but if the amino acid profile of them isn't right, you need lots of, I think, lysine and methionine are 2 key ones there in the growing calf. If a lot of them are coming from plant-derived sources, they mightn't have that kind of a quality amino acid profile to ensure good growth in your calf.
George, that's an important point in terms of price as well, because obviously the vegetable proteins are probably cheaper.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And how we know, Stuart, is if there's a high fiber content. If the fiber content in the milk replacer that you're buying is high, so if it's over 0.1%, there's a good chance that some of the protein sources in it are being plant derived. So we were aiming our recommendation, or the AHI Technical Working Group recommendation, is that fiber content should be very low, less than 0.1%. And if it is, in general, you're getting a high quality milk replacer that's milk protein derived. They're the kind of 4 specs we talk about.
Whey or skim, basically, is what you're talking
generally about. Whey, skim milk powder, or preferably whey milk powder. One or the other will do that for you. And if you think about the whey powders, they're very expensive per ton at the moment, because you're competing with bodybuilders to buy them. Basically, is what we're saying. Yeah, I think at the moment someone told me they're about I think it's either $14,000 or 14,000 euros relative to the skim milk powders. They're about 4,000. I presume they're traded in dollars, 4,000 a ton. Okay. Yeah. So look, we're looking for a kind of a quality milk replacer, and that's the kind of spec that's been set for those type of products. Now we'll talk about price in a minute. We'll come back to that. Okay. One of the earlier at it actually, and I thought it was going to come out. In terms of the cost of milk replacer, how do we calculate? You were referring earlier on there, Stuart, to people maybe going back to whole milk. Because of the price of the powders. So the powders have jumped at least a tenner a ton, and someone told me they've gone up again in the last couple of days. I look around there and we can see powders on the market for €45 a ton. Beg your pardon, €45 a bag. We can see them for between 55 and €60 a bag. Look at the spec. Buy on the spec. If the spec is right and they're relatively good value, you go for them. just taking a price, so we'll use a ballpark there of €58, which is midway between some of the powders I'm looking at that are available at the moment. Typically, your bag of powder we're talking about is a 20-kilo bag for that kind of money, whether it's 55, 56, 58, whatever the price is. If we assume a mixing rate, which is a kind of a fairly common mixing rate used for twice-a-day powders of 125 grams per litre, a 20-kilo bag of the powder would make 160 litres of milk replacer solution. And at a cost of €58 for the 160, for the powder for 160 litres of made up, that's the equivalent of 36.25 cents per litre before water heating costs and mixing costs are accounted for. So you're talking a ballpark around somewhere between 35 and up to 40 cents per litre for the powders that you're going to be using to as in a milk replacer format before heating and mixing costs. So that's the kind of price they were a good bit less last year, Stuart. It was working out at around £10 a bag last year, but look at the way things are at the moment. This is the cost we're talking around 36 cents per litre is what we're talking about.
So it's up about 20%, I think. There's actually
about 20%, exactly.
There's a supplement in the journal today now as well, and it actually has a good share of the products now. Not all products are listed in it, and it's going to give you the price per ton for each of those as well, so people will be able to see. Off the top of my head, I think we're talking about around 2,000 a ton last year, and it's up closer to 2,500 a ton for a lot of those, or 2,500 a ton for a lot of those products now. But I suppose the key thing there, George, before you move on, is I know Kerry sent out forward milk price text there yesterday to their suppliers, and I saw it on online as well last night. We'll say that they're talking about maybe 43 or 44 cents, I think, on the forward price, or 42 cents, sorry, I think 42, right. 42
as a base price, sure.
Yeah. So it's quite on a par in terms, they probably work in tandem really. So when milk price is good, your milk replacer price is obviously going to increase. If you're going down the dairy product, like if you're using the vegetable proteins, it's probably going to stay a little bit cheaper. But then, as you said, it's not the ideal scenario.
No, not for young calves. I wouldn't recommend them, Stuart. It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
I think what will determine it more than anything else is convenience. What suits the operation that you're on? If the setup is in such that you can feed, that you can make up a milk replacer easily, but then I'd probably go down the milk replacer route. In terms of performance, it'll be relatively similar. But if your setup is not suited to rearing cows and replacer, and really you have a system in place that'll feed cow's milk to the calves, well, look, there's no problem feeding that either.
Yeah.
It's not price is not going to drive it.
Yeah, exactly.
One over the other. Put it that way. One versus the other, milk replacers will have a slightly lower energy content than whole milk. Typically, the reason for that is because our typical milk replacer will have an oil or fat content, which is where the energy is, of between 16 and 20%. In terms of whole milk, it'll have a fat content of around 25%. And the fat content is what's driving the energy content of the milk. So typically, it'll have a slightly lower energy content than whole milk. There's huge variation between the products, as we're already alluding to. Just be very careful of the spec of the product. If you're getting something you can get products at the moment that are costing around €45 a bag. Just have a look at the bag of powder and make sure it meets the criteria we set, particularly for the very young calf. We've seen it before, we're saying it again. Non-milk proteins are not suitable for very young calves. You really need for whey or skim in the ingredient list for those sort of calves, and plenty of it. And in terms of protein requirements, if we're pushing for a higher growth rate, you probably need some of the upper end of the protein content in those, and that will drive bone and meat growth rather than put a layer of fat on them. Oftentimes, anecdotally, what you hear farmers talking about the calves that are going to sell will go on whole milk, and they look roundier and fatter, but the performance on the milk replacer will be similar in terms of live weight gain. It'll be a different form of growth. It'll be less fatty growth. It'll be more bone and flesh growth that you're seeing in those calves. No real difference in performance if the replacer is of a reasonably high quality and meets the spec we talked about. How much does a calf need? Well, traditionally, when I was growing up as a child, about 4 litres a day, about a gallon a day is what we fed to the calves, 4.5 litres. The new thinking is that really we're talking about looking for greater growth from our calves and feeding around 6 litres of a 12.5% or 125 gram powder per litre mix is what we're talking about. That's a total of around 750 grams per calf per day. And there's a reason for that, Stuart. If you look at what the 750 grams of powder can support, well, it'll support two things. The first is it'll support maintenance of the calf to keep it ticking over, but it'll also support growth of the calf. So with 750 grams of powder going in, and we're assuming a 15 degrees Celsius calf house here for the young calf. In that scenario, the maintenance requirement for the calf is the equivalent of around 380 grams of the powder that you feed. So what you feed on top of that will promote growth. And typically we're talking about growth rates, surpluses then of around 370 grams. And as a rough rule of thumb, if you divide the 370 grams in two, that's the kind of growth rate we're talking about in kilos of gain. So about 185 grams of gain will be achieved with 750 grams of milk powder going in to a calf in a house that's at a temperature of 15 degrees Celsius. So temperature is also interplaying in terms of the kind of growth we can expect from our calves when they're being milk fed. If we look then, we'll just stick to the table in red there first, Stuart, in this one here. If you look at calf age, the lower critical temperature, so as the temperature goes down, more and more of the feed that a calf gets is being pushed towards maintaining the calf and keeping it warm. So if we talk about a newborn calf, the lower critical temperature for a newborn calf is around 15 degrees Celsius, which sounds quite high. It's higher than I would have thought. And typically we're looking at temperatures in I was in calf houses yesterday and a couple of farms short, and the temperature in them was around 7 degrees.
Yeah.
That's saying to me with the newborn calves, in fairness, yesterday was a cool enough day, but if we look at newborn calves, they're using more than the 380 grams of powder to maintain themselves. So you're going to get slower growth in those calves if they've been kept in a cold house. But very quickly, even the newborn calf becomes more temperature tolerant. And by 3 weeks of age, the lower critical temperature, or the temperature at which it needs to burn more energy to maintain itself, goes down rapidly. And I suppose the reason for that is there's a couple of things going on there. One is it's growing bigger. So bigger animals are more resilient to lower temperatures because of a smaller surface area relative to their body weight. And the second thing that's going on there is, they're starting to develop a kind of a proto-rumen. So once we can encourage them to eat meal fairly quickly as a young calf and start to develop the rumen. Rumen is like a hot water bottle. So it's like having a hot water bottle strapped to your tummy and walking around. You'd be a lot warmer with that on you than you would when you're effectively a monogastric, which is what the newborn calf was. So what people will do where houses are cold with calves is probably the simplest thing to do. Well, the first thing you should do, and Kira alluded to it the other night, Kira Hayes alluded to it the other night, Stuart, on the webinar that we ran. But one of the first things you'll do is have the thermometer in the house so you can see what the actual temperature is. That'll give you a good indicator of whether it's warm or cold.
And that's a Macmin. Sorry, George. That's a Macmin thermometer, yeah, as opposed to your kind of standard thermometer, like.
Exactly. The second thing, Stuart, is you can give them a real good bed of straw. A real good bed of straw, it'll be up around what's called a nesting score. The nesting score is 3 short, where basically the legs are hidden in the straw. And that's like a little blanket under them, or kind of a duvet around them. And that'll make them more resilient to lower temperatures, and they won't be burning up extra feed to maintain themselves. And in some cases, the third thing you can do is people are putting heat lamps under fairly young calves to give them the option of going in under it if they're feeling a bit on the cold side. And that will allow them to warm themselves up in a localized point. And again, we're only talking about needing it for a couple of weeks, those kind of things. And the other thing is what people are using is they're using some of these calf coats.
Yeah.
And particularly for small, vulnerable looking calves. And what they'll do is they'll increase the temperature, I believe, by about 10 degrees. So a 5-degree house would be the equivalent of a 15-degree house with the coat on some of those smaller calves. And they only need it for the first couple of weeks to keep them warm. I go with the straw first myself because it's the cheapest option. But that's me, and I'd be tight. If you look on the right-hand side then, Stuart.
Yeah, the other thing, George, actually is canopy kind of area in the pen.
Exactly. I see those going in.
Creating a micro-environment inside it.
Does. And that will help, absolutely help as well. I can't tell you what the degree difference is, Stuart, but it is, you see calves lying under them in cold weather, so it must be doing something. It is the favoured environment of them. That's a fair point.
Yeah, and just, I suppose, George, and the health and safety, we better point out that people need to be careful with the heat lamps around straw and so forth as well.
Oh, yeah.
So some people actually have some heat lamps that are set up to cut in basically when the temperature drops below. Now it's elaborate, obviously, but
exactly.
And the heat lamps come on in the shade just to keep the environment warmer as well. So
exactly.
Anything that will avoid that basically, I always talk about it in context of, if you go to a match or a funeral, unfortunately, is the typical example, because it tends to be late in the evening or whatever, and you're standing around and it's cold. It's very hard to keep yourself warm. And the calf jacket, the way I think of it, is like the lights of the base layers that you see. I actually see a lot of farmers wearing them now, more and more as well, to keep their own body temperature up, we'll say, when they're out in cold weather in the springtime. So calf jacket is the same scenario, keeping the core warm, and obviously then you're not as vulnerable, I suppose.
You're not burning as much energy to maintain your
exactly.
core body temperature. Exactly. Yeah. Now, just on the right-hand side of this graph here then, so how much powder equivalent is required to maintain the calf? So at 15 degrees Celsius, we talked about the 380 grams of powder. But in that young calf, if it's at a lower temperature, say 5.5 degrees, it's requiring the equivalent of around 480 grams of powder to keep itself warm in those early weeks of life. So you can see that will reduce growth rates in those calves by the equivalent of around 10% for the same volume of feed, same quantity of powder being fed per calf per day.
Very close to a litre of replacer, if you say it, at 125 grams a litre. Like, so just
it's roughly under a litre of powder you're talking.
Yeah.
Of a replacer. Sorry, Stuart. Okay, the other question we're often asked is, and from a Ione's perspective, it's often seen as a kind of a preferred route to move calves quickly away from either the colostrum or the transition milk, particularly the heifer calves, and I tend to focus on those, excuse me, to move them quickly onto milk powder. So the research at Moorpark was carried out, and it looked at 3 stages. We had a yellow column here, and that refers to calves that were fed a quality colostrum and 4 feeds of transition milk. That's the second and subsequent milkings from the cow. And then onto a quality milk replacer, okay, until weaning time. Or the yellow column then refers to calves that got colostrum and were put straight onto a 26% or a high quality milk replacer after 1 feed of colostrum, 1 feed of quality colostrum. I suppose, Stuart, we didn't mention it, but it should come up, and it came up at the webinar the other night. How do you know quality colostrum? You get one of those, what do you call them, Stuart?
Briggs refractometers.
A refractometer, yeah. And make sure. And actually, I was out with a group yesterday, and one of the guys in the group had a refractometer, and he said it's unbelievable the variation in the quality of the colostrum the cow's producing. So he reckons it's an essential tool to determining quality colostrum. Anyway, all these calves got a quality colostrum. They got it for either once, followed by 4 feeds of transition milk and then a quality milk replacer, or they got 1 feed of colostrum and straight onto a milk replacer. And if you look at this graph here, at weaning time, at 140 days, and at 240 days, 8 months later, effectively, there was no difference in the performance of those calves. The only caveat I put in with that is, I had a farmer I know pretty well who had a significant ione's problem on his farm. And he followed the protocol that we laid out for him in terms of getting them quickly onto a quality milk replacer. He fed his bull calves and beef calves that were going off farm the transition milk, and he said that the performance of the beef calves was better. And the reason for that was because in his herd, he had a problem with scour in the calf house. And the scour was reducing the growth rate of his replacement heifers on the quality milk replacer. By feeding a transition milk in situations where there is a health risk to the calves, it protects them at the intestinal level and keeps their performance up. They were better protected than the calves that were on the milk powder, basically, is what we're saying.
So it's just a greater availability of antibodies through the transition milk for the couple of days extra, basically.
For the couple of days extra, or even a week or 2 extra.
So if someone is in that scenario, George, then like, no, obviously you'll have to be testing for Ione's, or you probably won't know you have Ione's problem in the first place, but trying to identify and store colostrum from good quality clean cows, we'll say, would be the objective there then, and trying to, there's a bit of management in it, but if you you could gather that milk then to feed a couple of extra transition feeds that you knew was clean, that would help alleviate against the Ione's, but also keep you in a good situation in terms of calf health then as well.
Right. And literally earmark the cows that are dubious for Ione's. What we've farmers doing at this stage, Stuart, is just put an extra tag in the rear, put a red tag in the rear.
Yeah.
Just a blank red tag, just to remind you that these cows are suspect.
Yeah.
And control what happens in them. It's when we have a visual cue with cows like that. It makes such a difference in terms of reminding people of the risks that they run.
Yeah.
So just one of the last slides I have, Stuart, is broad guidelines. So this isn't the definitive answer for it, but it's a kind of, people often ask you about how do we get our calves from twice a day feeding to once a day feeding in a kind of a relatively safe way. And one of the kind of broad guidelines, kind of rough guidelines for how it might pan out in reality is, we'll talk about a scenario where we have a calf that's gone its 28 days of age. It's on 6 litres of milk replacer, with 750 grams of milk replacer being fed in those 6 litres in 2 feeds a day. So the day before you start, put your calf on, keep your calf on it's on its 2 feeds in the day. On the day you start, you skip the evening feed. You give them the morning feed, 3 litres with 375 grams of powder in it. Then on day 1 of the new regime, it gets 3.5 litres of feed, and that'll contain 550 grams. And slowly step up the powder over a couple of days by 50 grams a calf a day. And you'll probably get to close to 700 grams of powder by about day 4. You might never get to it, Stuart. In some cases, the calves just won't drink it, because what you find immediately when they go this route, Stuart, is you'll find that they start eating a lot of meal. It makes them quite full very quickly.
Yeah.
But you'll get, we're talking about calves a month of age and more, and you should be able to step them up to around 20% solution over 4 or 5 days.
So it's important there, George, I suppose, as well, just if you jump back there one slide again, that people see that you're not trying to get to 700 straight in on day 1, like.
Highly risky.
Yeah.
Highly risky. The reason being, you're changing the consistency of the feed now, or the what they call it, osmolality, they call it. It's a fancy name for how thick it is. And you don't want to do things that quickly or that rapidly or drastically alter the passage of the liquid through the abomasum.
Yeah. So from the calf care webinar on Tuesday night, that's a key potential trigger for bloating calves. I think if rapid adjustment of osmolarity, so controlling that by stepping it up like you've described there is the way. It's
a like gentler way of doing it.
It's a bit like cows going to grass basically off the silage cold turkey. You could end up with issues with them, whereas when they calve, giving them the 4 days inside, they settle down a small bit, then they can go to grass. Maybe they might still be getting a bit of silage for a few days. Especially around frosty weather and so forth, with frosty grass, and just transitioning everything it's important that people don't just go bang like.
Exactly. I suppose finally, Stuart, if you want to read a bit more about some of the technical notes around calf milk replacers and the spec that they should have, there's a document there on the Animal Health Ireland website developed by the Technical Working Group on Calf Care. That's worth having a look at for people who want to pursue some of the information a bit further.
Yeah, and I suppose the key thing about that, George, is it's independent, would say, because obviously every company is going to be trying to push their angle on people. So trying to do your own research on it in the background. Yeah. This is an independent document.
It's developed by a panel of technical experts,
which will actually include some of the companies that are selling products.
Which does include the companies, and so it should. But it's a balanced reference document.
Yeah. So, George, I think this question actually came up as well the other night, maybe, but I will throw it at you again. And I know one of the other advisors was asking us about it there in terms of topping up, maybe. But Lawrence Sexton is just wondering, is there any advantage feeding whole milk with powders?
Yep, no problem at all. We're talking now, Lawrence, about the conventional 12.5% solution, and mixing whole milk through it does confer additive protection in the situation, particularly in situations where there's a bit of a disease floating around the place. Absolutely. But putting a transition milk mix through with whole or with a milk replacer shouldn't present any problems at all.
Okay, and George, I suppose something that we probably need to focus on, because with the best will in the world, we might start off well, but weighing out that powder, and maybe even Liam Gannon was saying the other night, and I've often heard it, is the changes of batches maybe as well. So you could have 2 pellets that you've gotten now, and even the 2 pellets that you have maybe out of a different batch potentially. So just when you do switch, checking the weights. Now, realistically, it's probably not feasible for people to be weighing out every lot of powder. So you need to get a constant...
Get a jug or a measure that you can use.
Yeah.
That's fairly constant. But I say checking now and again, checking regularly is a good idea, because you know yourself, Stuart, there's a little bit of drift goes on in places in terms of the quantities that are fed on a day-to-day basis. So maybe checking once a week to kind of recalibrate your eyes wouldn't be any harm.
Yeah, and we use a product at home, George, last year, and we just actually I just put an A4 page up in the parlour in the dairy to show what the mixing rates were for the various numbers of calves. And it was just made it so much easier, because you're often doing this calculation in your head about the number of calves in the pen. So there's two things I suppose people should be doing in terms of calf feeding is like your Hay said the other night, is calculating the space that they're going to be standing in and making sure that you don't overload that. And then you could write that up on the wall. And the other thing that you could write up on the wall then is either the volume of milk that to get, or the amount of powder, or how many jugs. I think is probably the easiest way, maybe, or how many measures or whatever.
Yeah.
And that works well in general. So I suppose to sum it up, George, if people have been on powder all along, there's no real reason, just because of the hike in price.
No.
A bit like fertilizer, you can kind of still need to use it, or you can still continue to use it. And I suppose the quality of it is important. Like anything in reality, you're going to get what you pay for. So the dearer milk replacer, while it is dearer, it's dearer for a reason, and it's because it's got a better ingredient profile and maybe better base constituents as well. So not like Grand Seal, it does exactly as it says on the tin, is kind of what you're looking for, isn't it?
Generally speaking, sure, absolutely.
Okay, so I think people are quiet there. Obviously, you covered all the bases, George, as always. So no, only the one question there from Lauren. So thanks for coming on this morning, and we wish everyone well for the week, and we'll be back again next week, and we'll talk to you then. So thanks very much, George.